Going through my late husband's belongings, I accidentally found his old bank account. When I checked, the balance was $88 million, but he always said his salary was $500 a month. When I called the bank, the manager went pale and said, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Calloway. Most people called me Maggie. And for 31 years, that name belonged to a woman who asked very few questions. I lived in a beige colonial house on Sycamore Drive in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of street where neighbors wave from driveways and nobody talks about money because nobody has much of it to talk about. Richard and I moved there in 1993, the year after we married, and I never thought to leave. The mortgage was modest, the lawn was maintained. The life was, as I used to describe it to my sister in Phoenix, enough. Richard was an accountant, or so he said. He worked for a mid-sized consulting firm downtown called Baxter & Mills, drove a 10-year-old Buick, wore the same 3 blazers on rotation, and came home each evening smelling of coffee and spreadsheets. He told me early in our marriage that he made just over $500 a month after taxes, a number that seemed low even then, but he explained it patiently. Benefits absorbed most of his compensation. The firm had an unusual structure, and besides, he had a small inheritance from his mother that covered the gaps. I believed him. I was 24 years old and in love, and love, I have since learned, has a remarkable talent for closing the eyes. We were not unhappy. I want to say that clearly, because what came after could make it easy to rewrite everything, to look back and see only shadows, but there were real years of warmth between us. Saturday mornings with coffee and the newspaper, vacations to the Outer Banks, Christmases that smelled like pine and cinnamon. Richard was a quiet man, private in the way that some men are private, who kept his feelings in his chest like folded letters no one was meant to read. I thought that was simply his nature. I thought I knew him. He died on a Tuesday in March. A heart attack, sudden and total, on the sidewalk outside his office building. He was 58 years old. The paramedics said he was gone before he hit the ground. Grief in its early weeks is mostly logistical. There are calls to make, forms to sign, people to feed. His brother Victor came from Pittsburgh with his wife Diane, and they sat in my living room drinking my coffee and patting my hand and offering to help with anything, which I later understood to mean help themselves to anything. But in those first days, I was grateful for the company, and I took their kindness at face value, another habit I would later break. It was 3 weeks after the funeral that I began sorting through Richard's home office. I had avoided the room. It smelled like him, old paper and a trace of the cedar soap he used, and every time I opened the door, grief landed on my chest like a stone. But the estate needed organizing, and I was the only one to do it. So on a gray April morning, with a cup of tea going cold on the desk beside me, I opened Richard's filing cabinet and began. Most of it was ordinary: old tax returns, appliance warranties, car insurance documents. I worked through the drawers methodically, creating piles. Keep, shred, unknown. It was in the 3rd drawer, tucked inside a manila folder labeled MISC 2009 in Richard's careful handwriting, that I found it. It was a bank statement. Not from our joint account at First Federal, where our direct deposits and mortgage payments lived. This was from a private account at Meridian Private Bank, a name I had never heard. The statement was dated 2009, 15 years earlier, and showed a balance of just over $4 million. My hands went still. I told myself it was an old account, perhaps dormant, perhaps closed. I told myself there was an explanation, but something cold moved through me. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Something older and quieter. Recognition, maybe. The feeling of a piece finally fitting into a puzzle you didn't know you were solving. I set the statement on the desk. I picked up my phone. My fingers, I noticed, were trembling slightly as I dialed the number printed at the top of the page. The line rang twice before a man answered. I gave Richard's name and the account number. There was a pause. The kind of pause that is not technical, but human. A pause in which someone is deciding something. "Mrs. Calloway," the man said finally, "could you hold for just one moment?" He put me on hold for 4 minutes. I counted. When he came back, his voice had changed. It was careful now, the way voices get when words are being chosen with great precision. "Mrs. Calloway, I'm going to need to transfer you to our branch manager. This account..." Another pause. "This account is still active." "Active," I repeated. "Yes, ma'am." His voice dropped slightly as though the walls of the bank might be listening. "And the current balance is $88,412,000. I said nothing. Outside my window, a robin landed on the fence post, tilted its head at something in the grass, and flew away. The tea beside me had gone completely cold. "Mrs. Calloway, are you still there?" "Yes," I said. "I'm still here." But I wasn't, not entirely. Some part of me had just stepped through a door that would never open from the other side again. The branch manager's name was Gerald Foss. He was courteous, careful, and visibly uncomfortable. Even over the phone, I could hear it in the measured spaces between his sentences. He confirmed what the first man had told me. The account had been opened in Richard's name in 2001, 8 years into our marriage. It had been funded consistently over the following 2 decades through what the bank's records described as investment returns and portfolio transfers. The account was in Richard's name alone. I was not listed as a beneficiary, nor as a signatory, nor in any capacity whatsoever. "Is there anything else I can help you with today, Mrs. Calloway?" Gerald Foss asked, in the tone of a man who hoped the answer was no. "Not today," I said, "but I'll be in touch." I hung up and sat in Richard's chair for a very long time. The house was quiet in the way that houses become quiet when the person who filled them is gone. The refrigerator hummed. A branch tapped the kitchen window in the wind. Somewhere down Sycamore Drive, a child was laughing at something. A bright, careless sound that seemed to come from a different world entirely. I did not cry. That surprised me. I had spent 3 weeks crying over Richard, over the smell of his blazer, over the half-finished crossword puzzle I found on his nightstand, over the voicemail from him I kept replaying just to hear his voice say, "I'll pick up milk on the way home." But now, holding the knowledge of $88 million in an account I had never known existed, I felt something that was not grief. It was colder than grief. It was precise. I began, methodically, to count. 31 years of marriage on what I believed was a combined income of just over $40,000 a year. Once my part-time salary at the Columbus Public Library was added to Richard's supposed $500 a month. 31 years of clipping grocery coupons. 31 years of driving used cars, buying off-season clothing, choosing the mid-range option, never the best. Our son Daniel had taken out student loans for college because we couldn't afford to pay his tuition outright, and I had felt guilty about that for years, guilty and inadequate, a mother who couldn't give her child the start he deserved. We had postponed a trip to Italy 3 separate times because the timing was never right. I had worked an extra shift at the library every Thursday for 6 years to help cover our property taxes. And Richard, my Richard, the man I had made coffee for every morning, the man whose socks I had washed and whose doctor's appointments I had tracked, Richard had been sitting on $88 million. The anger, when it came, was very quiet. That was the strangest part. I had expected something explosive, tears, or the urge to throw something, or the kind of rage that requires a closed door and a pillow to muffle the sound. Instead, I felt a slow, precise heat moving through my chest, like a pilot light being turned up 1 careful degree at a time. How long had he known? Who else knew? That second question stopped me. Victor. Richard's younger brother had always made me slightly uneasy in the way that certain people do, not because of anything they say, but because of the quality of their attention. Victor watched things. He watched me. My reactions, my questions, the way I responded when money was mentioned. I had always attributed it to his personality, the slightly competitive edge he had toward Richard. But now I turned the memory of him over in my mind like a stone, looking at what lived underneath. Victor had been remarkably composed at the funeral, too composed perhaps for a man who had just lost his only brother. And when he and Diane had sat in my living room in those first days, it was Victor who had first, gently, casually, asked whether Richard had left a will. I had told him yes. A simple document, leaving everything to me and Daniel, drawn up in 2015. I remembered the flicker that crossed Victor's face when I said it. I had read it as grief. Now I read it as something else entirely. He knew about the account. I didn't have proof. Not yet. But the certainty sat in my chest like a fact waiting to be confirmed. I got up from Richard's chair. I walked to the kitchen, poured my cold tea down the drain, and made a fresh cup. Then I sat at the kitchen table. My table, the one I had chosen, the one Richard and I had argued over because he thought it was too expensive at $400. And I thought carefully. There were 2 things I needed to understand. First, where had the money come from? $88 million does not appear in an account through ordinary investment returns unless the starting capital is enormous. Either Richard had been hiding income for our entire marriage, or someone had been funneling money into that account from a source I didn't know about. Both possibilities had legal implications. If the money was earned illegally, if it was laundered or connected to something criminal, it might not be mine to claim. If it was earned legitimately and simply hidden, that was a different matter. Second, I needed to understand what rights I had. Ohio is not a community property state, but there were legal avenues, an estate attorney. That was the first step. I did not call Victor. I did not call anyone in Richard's family. I picked up my phone and searched for the best estate and probate attorneys in Columbus. I wrote 3 names in the small notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer, the one I used for grocery lists and Daniel's schedule when he was a boy. Now I was writing something different. The plan was simple in its first form. Find out where the money came from. Secure legal claim to the estate. Do it quietly, before anyone could move against me. I underlined the first name on the list, James Whitmore, Whitmore and Associates, Estate and Probate Law. I would call in the morning. Tonight I needed to go back into that filing cabinet and read every single piece of paper Richard had ever kept. I wasn't afraid, or rather, I was afraid, and I chose to do it anyway. That, I was beginning to understand, was the only kind of courage that matters. James Whitmore's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building on High Street, overlooking a stretch of the city that Richard and I had driven past hundreds of times without ever going inside. The receptionist offered me coffee. I declined. I had slept 3 hours the night before, and I was afraid that if I added caffeine to the coiled alertness already running through me, I might vibrate clean out of my chair. Whitmore himself was in his early 60s, silver-haired, deliberate in his movements, with the kind of face that had learned over decades to reveal very little. He shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from his desk, and folded his hands on the surface in front of him. "Tell me everything," he said. So I did. I laid the Meridian bank statement on his desk. I explained what Gerald Foss had told me. I told him about Richard's claimed salary, about the filing cabinet, about the 3 other documents I had found during my late-night search, 2 of which were brokerage statements from an account at a firm called Ashford Capital Management, and one of which was a letter, dated 2003, from someone whose name I didn't recognize, addressed to Richard and referring to a partnership arrangement and a discretionary fund. Whitmore read everything carefully. He took notes in a small leather journal. He asked precise questions: the date of our marriage, whether Richard had ever filed separate tax returns, whether I had ever been asked to sign documents I didn't fully read, whether we had a prenuptial agreement. We did not. "All right," he said when I had answered everything. "Here is where we stand. Ohio law," he explained, "treats assets accumulated during a marriage as marital property, even if those assets were held in one spouse's name alone, and even if the other spouse had no knowledge of them. The burden would be on me to establish that the Meridian account contained funds accumulated during our marriage. But given that the account was opened in 2001, 8 years after our wedding, the presumption was in my favor. The more important question," Whitmore said, tapping the Ashford Capital letter with one finger, "is the source of the funds. If this money was obtained illegally, fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, it becomes subject to federal and state forfeiture proceedings, and your claim may be complicated or eliminated. And if it was legal, then you are looking at the largest unclaimed marital estate I have personally encountered in 30 years of practice." He said this without drama, which made it land harder. "We need to subpoena the records from Meridian and from Ashford Capital. We need Richard's complete tax history. And we need to do this before anyone else moves." "Before Victor moves," I said. Whitmore looked at me steadily. "Is there reason to believe he might?" "He knew something," I said. "I don't have proof, but I know." "Then we move quickly." I left his office with a signed retainer agreement and a list of documents to gather. It was a Tuesday, exactly 4 weeks since Richard had died on a Tuesday sidewalk, and as I walked to my car in the parking garage, I had the distinct sensation of having stepped across a threshold. Whatever came next, there was no returning to the woman who had clipped grocery coupons in ignorance. I did not know, that afternoon, that I was already being watched. Victor called me that evening. The timing, I later understood, was not coincidental. He was pleasant, solicitous even, asking how I was managing, whether I needed any help with Richard's paperwork, whether Daniel had been in touch. Casual questions, each one a small probe. When he mentioned, almost in passing, that he had a friend who was very good with estates and who could help me navigate the legalities, I felt the hair rise on my forearms. "I've already hired an attorney," I said. I kept my voice mild. "But thank you, Victor." A pause, brief, controlled. "Oh, of course. Who did you go with?" "Someone local," I said. "Very competent." I did not give him Whitmore's name. We talked for another 5 minutes about nothing, and when I hung up, I sat very still and thought about the quality of that pause. Victor was good at controlling his reactions, but not quite good enough. The documents from Ashford Capital arrived via Whitmore's subpoena 18 days later. I drove to his office on a gray May morning and sat across from him while he walked me through what the records showed. Richard, it turned out, had been a silent partner in a small private equity venture. Perfectly legal, filed with the SEC, paying taxes through a corporate structure I hadn't known existed. He had invested a modest inheritance from his father in 1999, 2 years before our marriage. But the vast majority of the account's growth, over $82 million, had accumulated after the wedding through returns, reinvestments, and a series of lucrative exits from small tech and logistics companies in the mid-2000s. The money was clean. Every dollar was traceable. Every tax return had been filed correctly under a separate corporate entity that Richard had never once mentioned to me. He had not cheated the government. He had only cheated me. "This is good news," Whitmore said carefully, watching my face. "Is it?" I said. "It means the estate is intact and claimable. It means there is no federal entanglement." He paused. "It also means Richard made a deliberate, sustained choice to conceal this from you over the course of your entire marriage." I looked at the brokerage statement spread on his desk. 20 years of returns, numbers climbing year by year, patient and precise and utterly hidden. The same man who had come home smelling of coffee and told me with a straight face that he earned $500 a month. "What about Victor?" I asked. Whitmore slid a single page across the desk. It was a corporate record, a registration document for the same equity entity, filed in 2001, listed as a passive investor with a small percentage stake, Victor Allen Calloway. He had known, from the beginning. He had known everything. I looked at the paper for a long time. Outside, 14 floors below, Columbus went about its Tuesday business, oblivious, ordinary, indifferent. "File everything," I said. "Move forward." "Are you certain?" I set the corporate registration document down on top of the brokerage statements and looked at James Whitmore across the desk. "My husband lied to me for 31 years, I said. "His brother helped him, and I clipped coupons." "Yes," Whitmore said quietly. "I am very certain," I said. The probate filing went in on a Thursday in late May. Whitmore handled it with the precision of a man who understood that speed was itself a form of power. He filed before Victor had time to retain his own counsel, before Diane could make any moves through the family connections she was so fond of invoking, before anyone could arrange for documents to go missing or memories to conveniently shift. The Meridian account was formally identified as a marital asset. The Ashford Capital records were submitted in full. Richard's concealment was laid out in the filing with clean, unemotional legal language that somehow made it worse. All those years reduced to tidy paragraphs, each one a small indictment. I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and a book I wasn't reading on Saturday morning when Victor's car pulled into my driveway. I had been expecting it. Not that morning specifically, but I had known, since the night of his probing phone call, that he would come in person eventually. Conflict for Victor required an audience. He needed to read my face. He needed to feel, physically, whether I could be intimidated. He and Diane came to the door together. That was intentional. Diane was Victor's counterweight, the softening presence he deployed when he wanted to seem reasonable. She was wearing a pale blue blouse and carrying a small arrangement of flowers, which she held out to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We wanted to check on you," she said. I stepped back and let them in. We sat in the living room, the same room where they had patted my hand in the days after Richard's funeral, where I had taken their kindness at face value. Victor looked around the room as though he were calculating something. Then he looked at me. "Maggie," he said, his voice low and reasonable, "we heard you filed probate papers this week." "Word travels fast," I said. "We have a mutual friend at the court clerk's office." He said this without embarrassment. "Maggie, I need you to understand something. That account, the Meridian account, was not something Richard intended for it to go through probate. He had plans, arrangements." "What arrangements?" I asked. "He didn't leave a will that mentioned that account." "There were verbal understandings," Victor said. I looked at him. Verbal understandings. I had been a librarian for 22 years. I understood precisely what words meant and what they didn't mean. "Victor," I said, "a verbal understanding is not a legal instrument." Something shifted in his face, barely perceptible, but there. The reasonableness pulled back an inch, and I saw what was behind it. "Maggie." His voice dropped. "I was Richard's partner in that venture. Legally, a portion of those returns should have come to me years ago. Richard and I had an agreement that when he died, I would be compensated. If you proceed with this, I will file a competing claim, and this will become an extremely public, extremely lengthy, extremely unpleasant legal proceeding. Think about Daniel. Think about the family name." There it was. I had prepared for this moment. Not rehearsed it exactly, but held it in my mind during those 3 hours nights, turned it over until I knew its shape. I set my coffee cup down carefully on the coaster. "Victor," I said, "your stake in the Ashford Capital venture is documented. Whatever percentage Richard agreed to allocate to you can be addressed through proper legal channels. My attorney will be happy to receive a filing from yours." I paused, "But I want to be very clear. I will not be withdrawing the estate claim. Not now, not later, not under any circumstances." Diane leaned forward. "Maggie, please, think about what you're doing." "I have thought about it," I said. "For 31 years, I ran a household on a budget that was a lie. I apologized to my son for not being able to pay his tuition. I drove a 2008 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard. I think I have done quite enough thinking about what I'm doing." The room was very quiet. Victor stood up. He was a tall man, and he used his height the way certain men do, as a kind of statement. "You are making a serious mistake," he said. "Perhaps," I said, "but it's mine to make." They left. I watched Victor's car reverse out of my driveway with slightly more speed than necessary, and then I closed the front door and stood in my hallway alone. My hands were shaking, not from fear, or not entirely, from the particular trembling that comes after your body has held itself rigid for an hour and is finally allowed to release. I pressed my back against the door and breathed. I called Whitmore first, reported the conversation in full, and confirmed that everything Victor had said constituted an informal threat that should be documented. Then I called my son Daniel in Chicago, and we talked for an hour. I told him everything finally and listened to the long silence on his end of the line before he said quietly, "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm going to be," I said. After I hung up, I did something I hadn't done since Richard died. I booked a room at a small inn near Hocking Hills, 2 hours south of Columbus, and I packed a bag. 3 days, trees and silence, and no one who needed anything from me. I drove there the next morning with the windows down and the radio off. I sat on the cabin porch at dusk and watched the light change in the hills, and I let myself feel grief for the marriage I thought I had, fury at the marriage I'd actually had, and underneath both, something new and fragile, but real. The first clear outline of who I was going to be when this was over. I was 52 years old. The account held $88 million, and I was just getting started. I came back from Hocking Hills on a Wednesday afternoon, and by Thursday morning there was already a letter waiting for me, forwarded from Whitmore's office, because Victor had been clever enough to address it to my attorney rather than to me directly. Legal stationery, neat rows of type, from a Pittsburgh firm called Reardon, Vasquez and Hill. The letter proposed a settlement. Victor, through his counsel, was offering to release any competing claims against the Meridian account and the Ashford Capital estate in exchange for a lump sum payment of $6 million, to be drawn from the estate and transferred to him within 60 days of agreement. The letter framed this as a good faith resolution in the interest of preserving family harmony. It used the phrase family harmony twice in 4 paragraphs, which told me everything I needed to know about the confidence with which it had been written. $6 million out of 88. I read the letter at Whitmore's conference table while he watched me carefully. "They're testing you," I said. "They are," he agreed. "The number is low enough to be insulting, which means one of 2 things. Either they don't believe you'll pursue this fully, or they're opening a negotiation." "They're wrong on both counts," I said. I set the letter down. "What is his actual legal exposure? His stake in Ashford Capital? What was it worth?" Whitmore opened a folder. Victor had held a 6% passive stake in the venture from 2001 to 2007, when he had exercised an early buyout clause and received payout of approximately $240,000. It was documented. It was complete. He had been paid out years ago. He had no remaining legal claim on the estate. "He knows this," Whitmore said. "Yes," I said, "he does." So the settlement offer was not a legitimate legal claim. It was a calculation, a bet that I was frightened enough, or confused enough, or sufficiently conditioned by 30 years of managing on not enough that I would take a number with 6 zeros and consider myself lucky. "Send a formal rejection," I said. Politely, precisely, with no counteroffer and no suggestion that there is a number we would accept. Whitmore made a note. "That will escalate things." "I know," I said. "Let it." I had lunch that afternoon with Carol Morrison. Carol and I had been friends since our children were in elementary school together. Her daughter Kate and my Daniel, both of them long since grown and scattered. We had drifted in the comfortable way that old friendships drift, seeing each other for birthday dinners and the occasional coffee, maintaining the loose, easy warmth of people who know each other's whole history. After Richard's death, Carol had been one of the first to call, and she had not made the mistake that many people make. She had not told me what to feel or when to feel it. She had brought a casserole and sat with me in the kitchen and talked about nothing in particular for 2 hours, and it had been exactly what I needed. Now I told her everything. We were in a booth at the small Italian restaurant near her house in Bexley, and I watched Carol's face as I talked. The careful attention she gave each piece of the story, the way she did not interrupt, the way she asked her questions only when I paused. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Maggie," she said, "how are you actually doing? Not legally, actually." It was such a Carol question. "I'm angry," I said, "and I'm grieving, and I'm not sure I know how to separate the two." "You don't have to," she said. "They can be the same thing." "I keep thinking about the Italy trip," I said, and to my embarrassment, my eyes went hot. We postponed it 3 times, and he was sitting on that money the whole time. And I stopped. I never even pushed. I just accepted it. You trusted your husband, Carol said, and there was nothing soft or minimizing in her voice. She said it as a simple fact with the directness that I had always loved about her. That is not a failure. That is what a person in a marriage is supposed to be able to do. We sat with that for a moment. What can I do? She asked. You're already doing it, I said. But she was practical. Carol. She always had been. Over the next hour, she did several useful things. She connected me with her cousin, a forensic accountant in Cleveland who could assist Whitmore in tracing the full history of Richard's corporate entity. She offered me her guest room if things at the house became uncomfortable, and she said something as we were putting on our coats to leave that I found myself returning to again and again in the weeks that followed. Richard made his choices in secret, she said. Everything you do from here, you do in the open. That's the difference between you. I thought about that on the drive home. The houses along the street looked ordinary from the outside. All of them. Every single one. That was the thing about secrets. They made houses look the same as all the others. It was only when you opened the filing cabinet that you found out what was actually inside. I unlocked my front door, stepped into the hallway, and felt for the first time in weeks something close to solid ground beneath my feet. They came on a Saturday evening in June, and they came without calling. I heard the doorbell at 7 o'clock, when the summer light was still long and golden across the living room floor, and I knew before I opened the door that it was them. I don't know how, some calculus of timing and tension, and awareness that Victor would interpret my formal rejection of his settlement offer as a kind of declaration, and that declarations required a response. Diane was carrying a bottle of wine, a good bottle. I noticed the label, a California Cabernet that ran to $60 or $70. The last time she had come to my house, she had brought a $10 grocery store arrangement of carnations. The wine was a statement. We are coming as equals. We are coming generously. We were in the neighborhood, she said, holding out the bottle with a warm smile. Victor was wearing a casual blazer, hands in his pockets, entirely relaxed in the way of a man performing relaxation for an audience. I held the door open and let them in because refusing would have told them something I wasn't ready to reveal, that I was afraid, and I was not going to give them that. We sat in the living room again. I put the wine on the coffee table, unopened, and brought out 3 glasses of water. Victor registered this without comment. Maggie, he began, we've been thinking a great deal about what happened last time we were here. Victor feels he came on too strong. Don't you, Victor? She looked at her husband. I do, Victor said with a practiced sincerity that must have taken years to develop. I was grieving, and I let my emotions get ahead of me. What I said about competing claims, I regret the way I said it. Notice, I thought, he did not regret the content, only the manner. I appreciate that, I said. The truth is, Diane continued, leaning forward slightly, she was the softer instrument, always. The one who was meant to reach the places Victor's edges couldn't. We're worried about you. This whole legal process, it's going to take years, Maggie. It's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. And for what? You don't even know where all of that money came from. What if there's something complicated that comes out in discovery? What if it becomes a public case? Your name, Daniel's name, in the papers. She let that sit for a moment. Daniel's name. They had chosen that carefully. Richard was a private man, Victor said. He wouldn't have wanted this in the open. No, I agreed pleasantly. He wouldn't have. He preferred things private, as I have now discovered. A small silence. The offer we made, Victor said, pivoting, was generous. $6 million, Maggie. That's generational wealth. That's security for you and for Daniel, without the risk, without the years of proceedings. Out of $88 million, I said. There are competing claims on that money, Victor said, and his voice dropped into something harder. There are parties you don't know about. Richard's corporate structure involved other investors, other arrangements. If you push this to full litigation, things will come out that you may not want to know about. There it was, the second threat, wrapped in concern. There are things I could reveal. He was implying, without stating, that he had some piece of information that could complicate my claim or embarrass me. Whether or not he actually had it was another question. What mattered was that he wanted me to believe he did. I looked at Victor for a moment. Then I looked at Diane. Then I picked up my glass of water and took a small, calm sip. Victor, I said, your stake in the Ashford Capital venture was bought out in 2007 for $240,000. That payout is documented. You have no remaining claim on this estate. I set the glass down. If there are other investors or arrangements you believe are relevant, your attorney can file them with the court. That's what courts are for. Diane's mouth tightened. Victor's face had gone very still. As for things coming out that I may not want to know, I paused. Victor, my husband hid $88 million from me for 30 years. There is very little left that could surprise me. The room was quiet. You're making a mistake, Victor said. His voice had shed the warmth entirely now. You're alone in this, Maggie. You don't have the resources or the stomach for a real legal fight. You're a librarian from Columbus who got lucky, and you don't know what you're doing. I stood up. I think it's time for you both to go, I said. They went. Victor did not look at me as he passed through the doorway. Diane glanced back once, and in her face, behind the careful presentation of the last hour, I saw something raw and ugly, the expression of a woman who had expected this to work and was recalibrating in real time. I closed the door. I locked it. Then I stood in my hallway with my back against the door, and I let myself feel the fear. It was there. Of course it was. Victor was not a foolish man, and the threat about other parties, other arrangements, had been designed specifically to land in the place where my uncertainty lived. What if he did have something? What if Richard's money had a shadow I hadn't found yet? But the fear, as it moved through me, did something unexpected. It sharpened. It burned away the soft edges and left something harder underneath. The same precision I had felt in Richard's office chair. The night I first read the bank statement, I had come too far to be turned back by a man with a bottle of expensive wine and a gift for implication. I went to my kitchen, heated some soup, and sat at the table and wrote down every single thing Victor and Diane had said, in sequence, with the time and date at the top of the page. I sent the document to Whitmore that night. Document everything he had told me at our very first meeting. I was a librarian. I had been documenting things my entire life. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in September, 6 months, almost to the day, since Richard had died on a Tuesday sidewalk. I woke at 5 that morning without an alarm. The house was dark and still. I showered, dressed in the charcoal blazer I had bought specifically for this. Not because I thought clothing would determine anything, but because I had learned, in the month since April, that preparation was its own kind of armor. I ate a piece of toast. I drank my coffee at the kitchen table where I had made my first list in the notebook that used to hold grocery reminders. Then I drove to the Franklin County Courthouse. The probate courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, wood-paneled, fluorescent lit, with the particular smell of old documents and institutional carpet that I recognized from years of working in a public building. Judge Lynette Crawford presided, a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a chain and an expression of focused, methodical patience. Victor was already there when I arrived, seated at the opposing table with two attorneys from Reardon, Vasquez, and Hill. He'd flown in from Pittsburgh the previous evening. Whitmore had confirmed this through the hotel booking that Victor's junior counsel had, inexplicably, charged to the same corporate card used for the legal filing. Small sloppiness, the kind that accumulates. Victor did not look at me when I entered. He was speaking quietly to his lead attorney, a compact man named Sorensen, and he maintained this performance of absorption throughout the preliminaries. Diane was in the gallery. She was wearing black, which I found notable. Judge Crawford called the proceeding to order. Whitmore presented our case with the efficiency of a man who had spent 6 months building something airtight. The Meridian account, opened in 2001, 8 years into the marriage, funded through the Ashford Capital corporate vehicle. The full tax history, clean, filed correctly, no federal entanglement, the marriage certificate, the 31 years of joint household records, mortgage, utilities, a documented lifestyle entirely inconsistent with the known assets. The argument was simple and devastating. Richard Calloway had concealed marital assets from his wife for the entirety of their marriage. Under Ohio law, those assets were marital property. His widow was the rightful heir. Victor's team then presented their competing claim. Sorensen was polished. He argued that Victor had been an integral, ongoing partner in the venture that generated the estate's value, that there were verbal agreements between the brothers about the disposition of the account, and that Maggie's claim should be offset by whatever sum was owed to Victor under those agreements. Your Honor, Sorensen said, Mr. Victor Calloway had full knowledge of this account and its growth over the course of 20 years. He was not a passive observer. He was a foundational participant. And there it was. Whitmore had warned me to watch for exactly this moment. He had seen it in the filing, the error buried in the competing claim's third paragraph in the effort to establish Victor's locus standi. In order to justify his claim, Sorensen had needed to argue that Victor had continuous knowledge of and involvement with the account, which meant the filing formally established that Victor had known about the hidden marital asset for 20 years without ever disclosing it to me. Whitmore rose. Your Honor, I'd like to draw the court's attention to something Mr. Sorensen has just confirmed on behalf of his client. He picked up a copy of Victor's own filing and read the relevant passage aloud precisely without editorial comment. Mr. Victor Calloway had full knowledge of this account. By Mr. Sorensen's own argument, the opposing party has been aware for 2 decades that his brother was concealing a marital asset from his sister-in-law. This court may wish to consider what obligation that awareness creates and whether Mr. Calloway's silence constitutes participation in that concealment. The courtroom was very quiet. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, we have obtained a communication. He held up a document dated March 14, 2012, in which Mr. Victor Calloway wrote to his brother Richard requesting an informal disbursement from the Meridian account, referencing it by account number. This letter was sent to Mr. Calloway's personal email, which he listed in his own legal filing as a correspondence address. He paused. Mr. Calloway was aware of this account. He communicated with his brother about it, and he did not disclose its existence to the court, to opposing counsel, or to his sister-in-law. Not when she called him the night Richard died, not when he sat in her living room in the days after the funeral, and not when he filed his competing claim. Judge Crawford removed her reading glasses and looked at Victor. Victor's composure held for approximately 4 more seconds. Then he turned to Sorensen and said, at a volume that was audible throughout the courtroom, "You told me that letter wasn't discoverable." Sorensen put a hand on his arm. It was too late. Crawford's gavel came down once, sharply. "Mr. Calloway, you will address this court through your counsel." Victor sat back. His face was the color of old chalk. Diane, in the gallery behind him, had gone very still. I sat at my table and looked at the wood grain of the surface in front of me, and I felt nothing dramatic. No triumph, no relief, not yet. Only the steady, quiet certainty of a thing moving correctly toward its conclusion, like a well-made clock, keeping accurate time. Crawford addressed both counsel tables. "I am going to call a 15-minute recess," she said, "after which I will hear arguments on the question of Mr. Victor Calloway's standing, in light of the disclosure made this morning." She looked at Sorensen. "Counsel, I would strongly suggest you use that 15 minutes to confer with your client about the implications of the statement made in open court." The gavel came down again. The courtroom stirred. I sat where I was. Whitmore leaned over and said quietly, "That's the ball game." "Not yet," I said, "but close." Judge Crawford returned from recess with the expression of a woman who had seen precisely this kind of thing before and had no patience for it. The 15-minute break had been eventful. Sorensen had delivered an urgent private assessment to Victor about the open court statement and its implications, and Victor had responded by blaming his attorney for inadequate preparation. None of this was visible when the court reconvened. Both men were professionally resealed, but it explained the quality of Sorensen's subsequent arguments, which were notably less confident than they had been before the recess. Crawford heard him out with patience and thoroughness, asked precise questions, requested specific citations. When Sorensen finally sat down, she made several notes. Then she looked up. "The court has reviewed the competing claim filed by Victor Allen Calloway and has heard argument from both parties this morning," she said. "I am also in receipt of the 2012 correspondence in which Mr. Victor Calloway makes direct reference to the Meridian account by number." She removed her reading glasses. "The law in this state is clear. A competing claim against a marital estate must be brought in good faith, with full disclosure of all material facts known to the claimant. Mr. Victor Calloway's own filing establishes that he had knowledge of the Meridian account for at minimum 14 years. He did not disclose this knowledge to his sister-in-law when he sat in her living room in the days after his brother's death. He disclosed it only when it became strategically necessary to establish standing." Crawford's voice had the quality of something irrevocable, words settling into the record, becoming permanent. "The competing claim is dismissed. The full estate of Richard Allen Calloway, including all assets held in the Meridian private bank account and remaining holdings through the Ashford Capital corporate vehicle, is confirmed as marital property and awarded to Margaret Ann Calloway as the surviving spouse and sole heir." She paused. "Additionally, This court is referring the matter of Mr. Victor Calloway's concealment of material information to the Office of the Franklin County Prosecutor for review of potential fraud-related charges. Mrs. Calloway, this court is sorry for your loss. The estate is yours. We're adjourned. The gavel. I sat for a moment after the room began to move around me. I did not look at Victor or Diane. I thought about Richard, the cedar soap, the crossword puzzle, the robin on the fence post. I thought about 31 years. I had not come here for revenge alone. I had come because the alternative was to absorb the lie and call it a life. And I was 52 years old, and the life ahead was going to be mine. Built on ground I understood, in money I could account for with eyes fully open. Outside the courthouse, Whitmore shook my hand on the steps. "Congratulations, Mrs. Calloway. You were extraordinary in there." "I didn't say anything in there," I said. "That," he said with a small smile, "is exactly what I mean." I drove home on streets that looked the same as always. The Civic's dashboard still had the crack in it. I pulled into the driveway on Sycamore Drive and sat for a moment in the quiet car. Then I went inside, put the kettle on, and called Daniel. "It's over," I said when he answered. "We won." I heard him exhale. A long, slow, ragged breath, months of worry releasing at once. "Mom, what are you going to do now?" I looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the fence post where the robin sometimes landed. "Everything," I said. "I'm going to do everything." I went to Italy in October. Not the sensible 2-week tour Richard and I had endlessly postponed. I rented an apartment in Florence for a month, a flat above a bakery near the Oltrarno, with terracotta floors and a window toward the Duomo. I woke every morning to the smell of bread and the sound of the city, completely present in my own life for the first time in years. I paid off Daniel's student loans in a single transfer and listened to him cry. I established a scholarship at the Columbus Public Library. I renovated the house, the kitchen I had always wanted, a reading room where storage had sat unused for 30 years. I left the Civic's cracked dashboard intact. Some things are worth keeping as they were. Carol visited for a week. Over dinner on a Florence terrace, she looked across the table and said, "You look like yourself." "Possibly for the first time," I said. Victor was charged with fraudulent concealment of estate assets 3 months after the hearing. His legal defense consumed savings far more modest than their lifestyle had implied. The Pittsburgh house sold in February and barely covered their debts. Diane's social world collapsed. The friends who had orbited their life were the kind that orbit, and when the gravity changed, so did they. Victor's trial was scheduled for spring. I would not be attending. Not every process needs a witness. I came back from Florence on a crisp November morning, made coffee, and stood at the counter in the kitchen I had always wanted,